So as an avid investor, one of my favorite things to do is to make mock portfolios to see what funds work well together and how to really make the best portfolio. And this is my current thinking and opinion when it comes to a very well optimized and simple and effective portfolio. I have half of it dedicated to the S&P 500, and this is split between the actual equities and covered calls to generate income off of the equities. And then the remaining half is split into two, so 25% quarters. One of these quarters is dedicated to value/dividend plays. So this is stuff like Divo, JEPI, maybe even SCHD. And then the other quarter is dedicated to growth. In my case, I like BST and VUG, maybe even IGV, all great growth ETFs in my opinion. So I think you guys can see my logic behind a setup like this and the distinct benefits it brings to the table. However, a potential major flaw in this setup is that the growth assets are pretty speculative, and you have to remember that we are currently coming out of a decade-long bull market. And with the fears of a recession, rising interest rates, geopolitical tension, there is less certainty than ever before that this bull market will continue. And if that is indeed the case, then this quarter of the portfolio isn't going to perform super well in the future. So that left me thinking that if these quote-unquote growth ETFs are too speculative and they're not going to perform well in the next decade, what are some good substitutes? And that's when I thought of this combo right here, DIVB and moat. Now, these two funds have very different approaches to investing versus a traditional growth ETF like VUG. So DIVB is from iShares, and it's the US dividend and buyback ETF. And of course, dividends and share buybacks are the two ways that companies can return profits to shareholders. And this ETF is all about capturing those companies, because all the other factors of valuation, PE ratios, all of that is outside the control of the company. And then the second ETF is ticker moat. It's from VanEck, and this focuses on companies that have a wide economic moat. And if this sounds familiar, that's because Warren Buffett is a huge proponent of investing in companies with a wide economic moat, and this means that the company has something that gives it a competitive advantage, whether it be a patent, high cost of entry, different market relations, really the list can go on, but to have a moat, the company has to have something very special and hard to copy. But I think these two funds just work extremely well together, and if you're afraid of slowing growth in the future and more speculative funds like BST and IGV, these two ETFs, because of their very specific approach, could be great alternatives. Okay, so this is the price action over the past 5 years. You're going to notice that DIVB isn't quite 5 years old, but even so, the VanEck ETF has done a little bit better, although over the past 1 year with all the volatility, it's flipped. And the dividend and stock buyback ETF, DIVB, has done a little bit better. Although if we come over to Portfolio Visualizer, this is the total return benchmarked against the S&P 500. Now, neither of these ETFs have a massive dividend yield. They're both around 1.5%, but still it has a meaningful impact on the returns, as we can see here. DIVB has a CAGR of 13.8%, moat is 15.7, and the S&P 500 is 15.1. These are the returns annualized between all three of these. And then down here we have the income level, and of course the US dividend and stock buyback ETF has the advantage here. Now, something I like to do when researching ETFs is to find the overlap between two different funds, and that can really help to place where an ETF belongs. So if we compare moat against the S&P 500, we can see they only have a 19% overlap. So that tells me right off the bat that there is some similarity between the two, but there's enough difference that they could potentially complement each other pretty nice when working together. If we do the same thing but with DIVB against the S&P 500, here we can see there's a lot more overlap. And finally, if we compare DIVB versus moat directly, we can see they have an overlap of 20%. Another comparison we can do to gain more insight here is to compare these versus a standard dividend ETF. So if we take DIVB and compare it against SCHD, we can see the overlap here is a little bit less at 16%. And if we do the same thing but with moat, that yields a result of 12%. If we take a look at the sector breakdown of DIVB As we just discovered, it is pretty similar to the S&P 500, just with a strong focus on those companies with stock buybacks and dividends. And if we do the same breakdown with moat, here we can see a much larger concentration in technology, healthcare, and consumer defensive. And even so, this gives you a dividend yield of just over 1%. So without question, I think these are two very intriguing investments. I think they both have a solid path to achieve great returns in the market, regardless of how choppy it might be over the next decade, which is something you can't say for a lot of growth-oriented ETFs. You can make the argument that a fund like divb belongs in the dividend side of a portfolio because it does focus on dividends, although the yield is less than 2%, and it's really not a dedicated dividend fund in my view. But let me know in the comments down below how you would utilize these two funds within your portfolio. In comparison to a growth fund like IGV, which is a tech software fund, I think the volatility is going to be way more manageable with these, and due to their very specific strategies of focusing on capital return to the investor and wide economic moats, I can't see why they would severely underperform. And especially if tech and growth does slow down and become more choppy over the next decade, these could be great alternatives for a steady rate of return. That's going to do it for the video. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you did and you're still watching, I appreciate a like on the video. Go ahead and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.